It was a race that should have been remembered for record-breaking performances and groundbreaking progress. After all, this was the first time in Olympic history that women were allowed to compete in track and field events at all. 9 women lined up for the final, and less than 2.5 minutes later, all 9 had finished, with 6 of them running the 2 laps faster than the previous world best. But instead of newspapers celebrating this milestone in women's running, the truth about that race was buried under headlines of scandal, exhaustion, and sexist backlash that would remove women's middle distance running from the Olympics for the 32 years that followed. Today is Saturday, August 2nd, 2025, and on this day in 1928, 9 women competed in the first ever 800-meter race for women at the Olympics in Amsterdam, a race that was so sensationalized by the media that the event would subsequently be banned for women until 1960. First, I'll give a little bit of background on this event, and then we'll meet Maggie Mertens, the author who covered this race and its impact extensively in her 2024 book, Better, Faster, Farther: How Running Changed Everything We Know About Women. I'm your host, Running Up That Hillary, and you are listening to Today in Running History. Today is Salty Saturday, which means that today's episode is sponsored by Salt Stick. We got pretty lucky in June and early July here in Texas with how mild the summer was, but over the last couple of weeks, the heat and humidity have returned with a vengeance. If y'all follow along on Instagram, which I really hope that y'all do, you'll see that I have been getting a lot of my runs done on the treadmill instead of outdoors. But I have about a 5-mile limit for indoor running before I go insane with boredom, so all of my longer runs have to be done outside. One of the few things that makes running outdoors tolerable when the feels like temperature is well above 100 degrees are the Fast Chews from Salt Stick. These are basically fruity little chewable tablets filled with electrolytes that, along with drinking water, make sure that I am replenishing the buckets of sweat that I lose. The Fast Chews come in a ton of awesome flavors, including peach, green apple, and mixed berry. And then there is a new caffeinated option that comes in citrus and in tropical flavors. I will put a link in the episode description so that y'all can check them out. And by using that link, listeners of Today in Running History will save 20% off your purchase. Now let's talk about the 1928 Women's Olympic 800-meter final. Back in March, since it was Women's History Month, I started listening to this incredible ebook called Better, Faster, Farther: How Running Changed Everything We Know About Women by Maggie Mertens during some of my runs. It was one of the best books I've ever read or listened to in quite a while, and it tells the story of all the hurdles women have faced within the modern history of running since that first modern Olympics in 1896. One of the chapters in Mertens' book is about this very race at the 1928 Olympics, and she did such a great job breaking down this event and its lasting impact. I reached out to Maggie, and I am thrilled to welcome her to Today in Running History. All right, I have Maggie Mertens, the author of Better, Faster, Farther, on today. How are you doing, Maggie?
I'm doing great.
Awesome. Can you tell us about your background?
So I am a journalist. I've been writing about women in sports for a little more than a decade now. And yeah, I wrote this book, Better, Faster, Farther, and it came out last summer, all about kind of the history of women and running and what it sort of means that that women have overcome all of the lies and myths people have told them about what they can and can't do.
And I loved this book, guys. Like I read this before I even reached out to Maggie, before I even started the podcast. Such a great book. And I listened to this at during Women's History Month in March. And that was a source for a lot of the things that I posted on Instagram. Some of y'all might have seen. And what got you kind of from the journalism side to actually putting this into a book?
Yeah. Well, I knew I wanted to write a book because as a freelance journalist, the opportunities to write about women's sports were kind of few and far between, especially 10 plus years ago. And I was kind of doing my best to pitch around, and definitely getting stories, around things like the Women's World Cup and the Olympics and things like that when they would happen. And I kind of found this just the whole idea of sort of the lack of respect in terms of equality, in sports, like to be a very interesting topic compared to, the way that we wrote. People would constantly be asking me to write stories about like women CEOs and
Yeah.
the gender pay gap and things like that. And I was like, this thing in sports is pretty a big deal. This is a pretty big pay gap. And so, I knew I wanted to kind of write about what that meant and that it wasn't just about sports. It wasn't just about, women not being as fast as men or something, and so
Yeah.
therefore not being paid as much. It was
Yeah.
really about the way that we see women in the world. And so, yeah, I really wanted to write a book about that, and running became kind of the perfect frame to kind of tell that story.
Great. And anybody listening, I definitely recommend her book. I will put a link to purchase it in the description of this episode. Now, let's talk about the 1928 Olympics, specifically the women's 800 meters, because that was a very controversial event. How did we get there? Because prior to 1928, women did not run in any events.
That's right. That's right. This 1928 was the first Olympic Games that women were allowed to have a track and field team at all. So these were the first events, and there weren't too many of them. They only had the 100-meter race, the 800-meter race, a 4 by 100 relay, and then they did have high jump and discus over on the field events. So three running events they were given.
Wow. And so runners who were doing that, they didn't have a ton of opportunity to compete before that. Where did most of these women get their start, or how did they start running?
Yeah. So at this time, just even being an athletic woman was extremely controversial. There was a lot of misinformation on the medical side and of course like in society about what women should be doing and even could be doing, what they were capable of entirely. And so, when women were running in these events, it was often more working class women, immigrant women, they often started running in like community groups. So there were like little community running clubs and things like that. And that's how a lot of these women started. And then around the world, there was kind of similar things happening, women wanting to be active because there was a big movement for men to, be playing more organized sports and being more active. Physical health was kind of in vogue at that time. And all around the world, you had, the Olympics starting. Well, women weren't really invited at first. And so there was actually a group of women who started their own women's Olympic games. And eventually they weren't allowed to call them the Women's Olympics. So they were known as the Women's World Games.
That sounds a lot like the world bests that were set at the time, because none of the actual world records were recognized by the IAAF. Everything was just a world best, and so unofficial at
Yes.
that point.
Yes, lots of control over what things were allowed to be called at that time.
And so that day in 1928, that actually came the day after the heats, and everybody seemed to do okay during the heats,
That's
correct?
right. That's
Okay.
right. We ended up with nine runners at the starting line of the final of the final.
And you've watched the footage of this, and what have you seen as far as the women finishing this race and then immediately after finishing?
Yeah, so it was an 800-meter race, two laps around the track. It's a really beautiful race, actually. It's really cool to watch. You have these young women from all over the world who this is the first time they've ever been on a stage like this. Some of them, the silver medalist actually like didn't even run the 800 typically, but she had a bad race in the 100 and she like begged to enter the 800
Wow.
anyway, and ended up getting second. And you actually have at least six out of the nine, I believe, broke the previous world record for the 800
Wow.
meter. So it was a really beautiful race. And yeah, I mean, it looked pretty typical to what you would see, today.
And that's not surprising, but and I guess I shouldn't be surprised by this next part. None of us should at this point, but it still just blows my mind how this was portrayed in the media. Because despite the film footage looking like a normal race, and people were a little winded and tired after that, it was reported much differently. What did that look like?
Yeah, so in my research for this, I kind of tried to get as many sources as possible. And as I kind of lined them up next to each other, every single, newspaper, magazine account said some version of, these women passed out. They fell to the ground. Some of them didn't even finish, in some of these accounts, no one finished. In some of these accounts, every single person needed medical attention. And so there was just this very extreme description of, women just obviously not being cut out to run this 800-meter race. And that, to me was, of course, like surprising just in the sense that like it's so hilarious the way that they are portrayed. But also that, literally every description was also different in some way. So you also had like certain newspapers said there were nine women, certain newspapers said there were 11, certain newspapers said there were
Wow.
five. Like, so you had all of this misinformation at once, but because all of them said some version of, these women basically couldn't hack it, you had like an extreme response societally.
And so they had nine starters, eight finishers, which is pretty typical for any track race that you watch now. But pretty much everything just, some said that that nobody even finished at all. That's
Yes.
insane. Oh, that's crazy. Wow. So after these reports came out, what was the impact on that? We know that they didn't end up having this event again until 1960, but what did those conversations look like?
Yeah, I mean, they were pretty extreme. So at this time, it was really a lot of men who were running literally everything, the IOC as well as, the IAAF at the time. And you had, countries, delegations who were saying that, like many of them didn't even send women to the to the track and field events that year because they thought it was so, against morality basically to have women running at all. And so then you had a big push to get rid of all of the events, to not allow women to do track and field again in the following Olympics. Um, that narrowly was voted down, but they did vote to not include the 800 again in the next Olympics. And you're right, it did not come back until 1960. And they also tried to get the 200 meter even added. And that was also voted down at the time. So
Wow.
so in 32, you only the 100 meter was the longest that women were allowed
Wow.
to run.
Wow. That just blows my mind that they even when they tried to get in the 200 meters, that was still deemed too far. That just blows my mind. And
Yeah.
obviously, we know that women can handle as far of distance as any men, and sometimes, once you get to a certain distance, they handle it better.
Yeah.
Um, but that's just crazy. This was less than 100 years ago.
Yep. Yeah, really not that long in terms of, all of society.
Wow. All right. Well, is there anything else about that race or those Olympics in particular that you want to make sure our audience hears today?
I do think that the one thing that was really interesting about it was one of the main concerns that many of these men would bring up was that, if these women ran too far, they wouldn't be able to have children. And that was like really the biggest concern. And I think, it was completely unfounded, of course, medically. But it was a very convenient excuse, right, to try to keep women from doing a thing that they really wanted to do. Because you could kind of say, oh, this will be really bad for society, if women aren't able to have children. So it was like actually a really big deal when the one American who made the final, Florence McDonald, several years later, she had her first child, and it was like big headline news in the Boston Globe.
Wow. That just blows my mind. And I have one final question, and I think I probably know the answer already, but I'm going to ask it anyways. During these post-Olympic conversations about taking away all of the women's events, and then at the very least the longer distances, were there any women involved in those conversations?
No, at that point, the women who were kind of running their own things, their own federations, had been pretty much pushed out.
Okay, that's what I was going to assume, but I wanted to ask the question in case maybe it would surprise me, but it doesn't. Wow. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Hillary. This was really fun.
Wow. Thank you so much to Maggie Mertens for joining me today and to all of y'all for listening. I could not recommend her book more, so I will go ahead and include a link to check it out in the description of this episode. If you enjoyed this episode of Today in Running History, please make sure to like, subscribe, comment, rate 5 stars, share, turn on alerts, and then send to a badass female runner you know that 1928 newspapers would call wretched and unfeminine. Once again, it is Salty Saturday, so check out the link in the episode description to save 20% off your entire order from SaltStick. And then join me tomorrow as we head to the 1990s to meet a man that refused to drop out of his race even when he could barely walk, and the support from his father that got him to the finish line. I'm your host, Running Up That Hillary, and this has been Today in Running History. All right, and then this is where we do the interview. All right, so tell me about this stuff. Yeah, it was 1928, and they ran an 800. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that's where the interview goes. Badass female runner that you know. That you know. Okay, that was hard. Okay. Oh, yeah, and I'm wearing eye makeup too because I'm about to go to a wedding, so hopefully y'all like that. Today is Saturday, August 2nd, 2025, and on this day in 1928, 9 women competed in, God damn it.